It's a fascinating and deeply disturbing thought to me that the Nazis were looking at the Jim Crow laws as a model to emulate. So the Nuremberg laws, much like the Jim Crow laws in Louisiana, aim to isolate and marginalize entire groups of people. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for joining me again on my channel, where we have been digging into hidden heritage, hidden history. What does it mean to become an American, and questions of identity and belonging? Now, I say this a lot in the comment section, but I just want to say it out here. I am learning in public. This channel is, I hope, a place where we can be learning together and contributing to everyone's understanding on these topics. And so do I know everything about every topic I'm talking about? No. And guess what? Neither does anyone else, despite what they may claim. I'm about to kind of touch a topic that I think is important, but it does need to be handled with care. And so I'm going to do my best. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you disagree, if you have another opinion on this, send it my way. I welcome the discussion. So I want you to imagine for a moment that it's the year 1935, and you are finding yourself at the epicenter of what was then Nazi Germany. Two pieces of legislation, the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, otherwise known as the Nuremberg Laws, are being enacted. These laws would go on to form the sinister bedrock of state-sponsored persecution of the Jewish population, among others, during the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II. But where do you think the Nazis found inspiration for such deeply discriminatory laws? Well, in the land of the free, of course, says historian James Q. Whitman, who is the author of Hitler's American Model, and he's a Yale Law School professor. So that's right. His argument is that Hitler based his laws and his vision on the United States, specifically 20th century America. So according to Whitman, now, Nazi lawyers had a keen interest in American racial law, especially the Jim Crow era laws that were obviously, unabashedly racist, discriminatory, but it doesn't necessarily establish that the US's racial laws had extremely formative influence on what Hitler was doing. It's not like Hitler, was headed on one path until he heard what was going on in the American South, and he did an about face and headed down the path that he ended up taking. But I do feel like we should look at the uncomfortable parallels, because it's the same time period. Now, I want to just stop here. This is not a channel where I bash America. I love America. I'm proud to be an American, and I do not think that America today is what America was in the past. We have grown, we have improved, and I do believe that we are improving with every generation, even if it's incremental. She is a great nation. But we've had some growing pains. And in 20th century America was racist in ways that I think some of us can't even really understand, because it is not the world that we live in, despite what the media is telling you. Public spaces were divided into white and colored, from schoolrooms to streetcars to water fountains to restaurants to bathrooms. Parallel to this, in Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg laws sought to enforce a similar ideology. And it was grounded in this false theory that the world was split into races that were inherently unequal in strength and value. And the Germans, according to the Nazis, were the superior Aryan race, and the Jews, who were perceived as being from a different race, were seen as a threat to the superiority. It's a fascinating and deeply disturbing thought to me that the Nazis were looking at the Jim Crow laws as a model to emulate. Now, one of the most striking Nazi views, he writes, was that Jim Crow was a suitable racist program in the United States because American blacks were already oppressed and poor. But in Germany, where Jews were perceived as, having wealth or having some power, the Germans felt like they needed a more severe approach. So instead of mimicking segregation, they focused on how the U.S. managed to categorize Native Americans, Filipinos, and others as non-citizens despite their residency here in the American territories. And this influence fed directly into Reich citizenship law, which took away citizenship from Jewish Germans and reduced them to mere nationals. So this first step is to say, well, you aren't really a citizen. That's the first step, is to take away that protection of citizenship. What did they find useful from the Jim Crow era laws? Well, one of them were laws prohibiting interracial marriages, which was prevalent in 30 out of our 48 states at the time. And these laws, Whitman remarks, were by a wide margin the harshest globally at that time. So, in their drive to implement a similar ban between Jewish and German marriages, or German and Aryan marriages, I should say, in Germany, the Nazis faced an intricate puzzle. How could they distinguish the Jews from the non-Jews? So again, they looked to the American legal system for guidance. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor, just pretty crazy sounding, which was the second Nuremberg law, was akin to the anti-miscegenation laws in Louisiana. So that law banned marriages and relationships between Jews and those considered German or of German blood, which is a direct parallel to what was happening in the American South. Now, the Nuremberg laws borrowed from the US's one-drop rule. So the one-drop law basically determined that anyone who had Black ancestry was legally Black. And there were laws defining what made someone Asian, Native American, anything to prevent these people from intermarrying with people who are white. The Nuremberg laws, borrowing from these practices, devised their own system to segregate Jewish and Aryan people based on the count of Jewish grandparents that one had. So if you had 3 or more Jewish grandparents, you were legally considered Jewish. This law, as Whitman highlighted, makes one realize that the American racial classification law, he notes, was much harsher than anything the Nazis themselves were actually willing to introduce to Germany at the time. So just to rephrase that, this Nuremberg law basically said if you have 3 or more Jewish grandparents, you were Jewish. So the way I'm interpreting that is that if you had 2 or 1, you didn't have to count as being of Jewish blood. Compare that to the one-drop rule, which is exactly what it sounds like. A question you may have, or something you may want to point out, is that what happened in Germany and what happened in Europe didn't happen here. Now, while both the American South and Nazi Germany drew on a core of racial superiority in their laws and social norms, their respective histories and structures prompted very divergent paths. So despite these deeply entrenched racial segregation laws here in the United States was still rooted in a framework of Enlightenment thought, which emphasized individual rights, equality, and freedom, even if it wasn't being practiced to the fullest extent at the time. And the Founding Fathers embedded these principles into the Constitution, making it, at least in theory, adaptable to changes with societal beliefs and values. That is to say, that was it being expressed at the time? No. But our Constitution had the building blocks there for us to grow and improve and change and support that along the way. So though the implementation obviously at this time in the 30s was flawed, deeply flawed, it offered a degree of flexibility that was not present in Nazi Germany's, their rigid ideology. So Nazi Germany, on the other hand, was anchored in this doctrine of racial purity and Aryan superiority. It was an ideology that was both essentialist and exclusionary in nature, asserting that certain racial groups were intrinsically superior or inferior, not just to segregate, but to exterminate. And obviously the Holocaust is a testament to this brutal culmination. Secondly, the trajectory of race relations in both nations was heavily influenced by domestic and international circumstances. So in the United States, there was the pressures of the civil rights movement and international criticism of our racial policies during the Cold War. And gradually, our country was pushed to do the right thing. Now, in contrast, Nazi Germany's policies were only brought to an end by their defeat in World War II. I think it's critical to recognize also the influence of leadership in shaping the course of these racial ideologies. So in the United States, it has a democratic structure, even if its implementation is flawed. And so we see a transition of leaders who had varying degrees of commitment to racial equality. These changes, albeit slow, were continuous and eventually did lead to landmark decisions like Brown versus the Board of Education. We have the safety net of new voices are going to come at some point, and we're not stuck with just the same person's perspective for 50 years. The totalitarian rule of Adolf Hitler allowed for a singular, uncompromising vision of racial purity, and that dictated national policy. And I think that monolithic leadership, which was free from checks and balances, pursued its racial ideology to its horrific conclusion. So, in conclusion, I do think while the United States and Nazi Germany both had historical periods of enforcing similar racial laws and maybe walking even on a parallel path, their views on race ultimately diverged. A lesson for us today on the dangers of not only following the path of racial ideology, whichever way it takes you, whether you are a proponent of white supremacism or black supremacism or anything in between. I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, it turns into the issues with white people. And I'm not disputing this history. This history is here. But I think we also need to be aware that the danger is not just inherent to the color of the skin of the person in power, it's the ideology behind it. And no matter who's on the receiving end of the mistreatment, it's wrong.